Hi guys, so welcome to lesson 4B, and as you can see by the title, we're talking about schemes and clauses, two words that hopefully you've heard of before, although my guess is that maybe that concept of scheme within rhetoric isn't something that you're necessarily familiar with, but it's not as outlandish and bizarre as you might think, and we'll talk about that in just a couple of moments. So to recap a little bit of where we are and where we're going with this, remember that this is a continuation of Unit 1's discussion on style. Remember that in Unit 1, when we were talking about style, we said, okay, one of the ways that a writer has a style is the words that they choose, the kinds of words, the subtlety of use of connotation and denotation and things of that sort. And now we come to the flip side of that, of course, remember, which is syntax. And we say, oh, well, part of an author's style is going to be the order in which they're using words. So we went from diction, which is word choice, to syntax, which is word order. And today we're starting to get in a little bit more into the mix of all of this word order business. I know that lesson A was very much about the basic terminology of grammar, and I told you this unit is going to be very sort of grammar focused. We're getting a little bit more into, okay, well, what does syntax actually entail, okay? And you kind of see that up here with that first term that we're taking a look at, which is, of course, one of the titles of the lesson, scheme. What do we mean when we say scheme? Well, we're not scheming something in the traditional fashion. It is artful syntax, which might be a deviation from the normal order of words. So anytime that an author is sort of assembling words in a unique and interesting pattern, particularly one that might be very unique to them personally and outside of the normal expectations of language. Now, the thing that comes up as we're talking about this, though, is, okay, if it's a deviation from the normal order of words, one of the things we need to talk about is what are the normal order of words, okay? And one of the things you might recall is, and we'll get into this a little bit more before the end of today's lesson, but we talked about how that there are every sentence is going to have a subject and a verb, often an object as well. The traditional fashion of an English language sentence is subject, verb, object. However, we have flexibility. Not every sentence has to be that way. That's just very much what a normal sentence is going to look like. So if you're starting to deviate from that, you're already starting to establish a certain kind of scheme of your own, okay? Now, obviously, this means we're also going to talk about other things regarding what makes normal language normal. And so we're coming down here to this concept of clause, okay? Which is a word that probably you've heard before. It might be also one that you've sort of forgotten and pushed out of your mind because, well, really, in a lot of cases, we don't need to know the word clause. Because if you take a look down here, it says, what is a clause? It is a group of words containing both a subject and a verb. And a lot of people, myself included, when I was not an English teacher, I would think to myself, well, why do I need to know the word clause? It's just another word for a sentence. And to some extent, that's true. You may recall from elementary school, though, that don't forget that a complete sentence is going to have actually three things. Yes, it's going to have a subject. Yes, it's going to have a verb acting as predicate, but it's also going to have a complete thought. And that's one of those things that sort of helps us differentiate the different varieties of clauses that are at our disposal. And we kind of start off right with that, the whole concept of a dependent and a subordinate clause. So yeah, I try to use dependent slash subordinate in each of these cases, just like I tried to use independent slash main. Again, they're interchangeable, depending on who you're talking to and what you're writing about. People will use one or the other. So just, I don't care if you call it just a dependent clause or just a subordinate clause. I'm going to know what you're talking about. And certainly anyone else who's in the English biz will know as well. So what is a dependent subordinate clause? Well, this is a clause that does not make sense when it stands alone. AKA, if a clause always has a subject and always has a verb, then the dependent subordinate clause is the one that's specifically lacking that complete thought that we refer to, okay? And as a consequence of that, it must always be attached to another independent main clause. And we'll come back to that independent main clause in a second. As you can see, that's our next thing. So what's a good example of this dependent subordinate clause? If it's got a subject and it's got a verb, how can it not have a complete thought? Well, A great way to think about this are some of those what we would call subordinating conjunctions. Some subordinating conjunctions are like because or while, okay? If I said, because I went to the store, that's a dependent subordinate clause. It's got a subject, I, went is the verb, okay? So you've got the subject, you've got the verb, but if I start a sentence and end a sentence with just that, because I went to the store, we're all just sort of left here hanging. Well, okay, because I went to the store, what? What happens next? That's where that lack of complete thought is going on, okay? Again, I used the example of the word while. While I was at the store, while I was mowing the grass. Well, okay, what while you were mowing the grass? You've got your subject, you've got your verb, but you're lacking your complete thought. And that's why, as I said, every dependent or subordinate clause is going to have to attach itself to an independent or main clause, okay? This is a clause that can stand by itself and still make sense, okay? So, case in point, because I was at the store, I decided to buy candy, okay? While I was there, I decided to buy some candy. So you'll see that I decided to buy candy is an independent main clause. While I was at the store, because I was at the store, those are the dependent clauses. We need to attach them to each other. They can't stand alone, all right? All complete sentences, as a consequence, must have at least one independent main clause. Now, as I've said to you many times before, that doesn't mean we can't break the rules. It's just if you want to make every sentence a complete sentence, you better make darn sure that every one of them has an independent main clause in it, or else you're not reaching that goal that you've got. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't the right time and the right places for dependent subordinate clauses acting as sentence fragments independently. Remember, if it helps the rhetoric, that's all that matters. Okay, you can break the rules as long as it helps the rhetoric, but you need to know the rules so you know when you're adequately breaking them. Okay, so when we're talking about syntax, this is a question that we're going to have to ask ourselves. Does the author have lots of independent main clauses? Does the author have lots of dependent subordinate clauses? Are the dependent subordinate clauses, do they typically come before or after the main clause? Are there incomplete sentences that are just dependent subordinate clauses? When you can start to make these generalizations about what an author is doing, you can start to analyze their rhetoric and their style and start to draw conclusions about that kind of stuff, okay? Now, that takes us down to sentence patterns, a lot of which you might be familiar with from elementary or middle school, and so we don't have to talk about that too much, probably just riff on the theme of going shopping as we give you examples for these things. So hopefully you remember what a simple sentence is. A simple sentence is a sentence with only a single independent main clause. So again, remember my examples from before. I decided to buy candy. That's an independent main clause. It's a simple sentence. Just that independent main clause, and that is it. Okay? A compound sentence is a sentence with two independent main clauses joined by a fanboy's word. And we'll be talking more about fanboy's words probably in the next lesson or two. But for the sake of argument, that is just for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. That is what fanboy stands for. Okay? So it's got two independent main clauses, two clauses that can stand by themselves, but we've decided to put them together. I decided to buy candy, comma, and I went home afterwards. Those are two independent main clauses attached together with a fanboy's word. But then, of course, we've got a complex sentence. So now it isn't two independent main clauses lumped together. It's an independent main clause and one of those dependent subordinate clauses. And I've given you that example. Because I went to the store, comma, I decided to buy candy. That's a dependent subordinate clause attached to an independent main clause. It is complex. And then, of course, you've got the compound complex. Now we've got a little bit of each. We want like long sentences, apparently, and we're saying we want two independent main clauses at least, and one dependent subordinate clause at least, okay? So that would be, if we sort of combined everything I've been talking about, that would leave us with, because I went to the store, comma, I decided to buy candy, comma, and I went home afterwards. That's a compound complex sentence. There are actually three clauses in it, And that means you've got 3 subjects with 3 verbs and two complete ideas, but only 1 incomplete idea, hence that dependent subordinate clause. So again, some of these you might be familiar with. You're going to want to start to be on the lookout for those and be able to start saying to yourself, oh, this author is really predisposed towards compound sentences. This author is really predisposed towards complex sentences or compound complex. Okay? Because when you start to make those kinds of observations, you're really starting to draw conclusions about author style. Okay? Now, some of the syntax schemes that we want to think about, ways that we can be constructing sentence syntactically in unique and interesting ways. Okay? First off, we want to talk about parallelism. Similarity of structure in a pair or series of related words, phrases, or clauses. You may hear me say that to you guys a lot. To sort of piggyback off of some terms from yesterday, remember, for example, if you have a series of items in a sentence and they're infinitives, they should all be infinitives. If you have a series of items in a sentence and they're participles, you would want them all to be participles. So, if you say, I like fishing and boating and to swim, that's a bad sentence because you have gerund, and then infinitive. Fishing is a gerund, boating is a gerund, to swim is an infinitive. That lacks the parallelism we should have. You want to make sure that they're very much similar parts of speech, similar types of terminology, things of that sort, okay? It's one of the reasons why those pride qualities that are posted in the hallway, prepared, respect, integrity, decision-making, and excel, those always bothered me because they lacked parallelism. They should all be the same part of speech. Pride, respect, integrity, decision-making, excellence. That makes more sense, but I can't change those things. That's what the school did, okay? Another thing you can do in your syntactical structure is juxtaposition, placing 2 things side by side for the sake of comparison or contrast. Okay, using 2 ideas within the scope of your sentence structure and sort of playing them off of each other, either to demonstrate these things are pretty much the same ideas and we're just showing them, but you also see that second sentence there that says incongruous juxtapositions produce verbal irony. So if you start to put 2 ideas in a sentence right next to each other and there's like no similarity to them whatsoever, well, now we're going to get the sarcasm in that comparison that you're making. Now we're going to start to say, oh, this is really, those things aren't anything alike and he's poking fun at that or something along those lines. So that whole word juxtapose means, setting 2 things next to each other and playing them off of each other, showing the similarities, showing the differences, whatever the case may be, okay? Specifically, as you can see, this is kind of an offshoot of that. You've got that whole concept of antithesis, literally antithesis, contradictory ideas that are juxtaposed, often using parallel grammatical constructions. So when you're using 2 sentences that are very much phrased similarly, but in the same way as you're doing that, these ideas themselves are very contrary, very opposite to one another. Well, we're going to sort of really get the sense of how different they are because you're striving in your sentence structure to be identical, to be similar, and yet at the end of the day, we're just looking at and thinking, my gosh, those things are so gosh darn different. Well, that's the point, okay? You're juxtaposing with the intention of really delineating, okay? Our third from last one here is, and again, as I've said to you before, I'm not good on pronunciation, and I don't know how these things are pronounced, so we'll just pronounce them the way it looks. Antimetably, I think, maybe, something like that, who knows. So this is the repetition of words in reverse order so that the subject of the first sentence becomes the subject of the second and vice versa. So like, I think a classic example that I hear a lot with this is, I rescued the dog, but then the dog rescued me. Moving, isn't it? That's kind of what we're talking about in this case, okay? The dog is the object of the first sentence, and I am the subject, but then in the second sentence, the dog is the subject, and I am, or me, is the object of the sentence. So it's sort of flipping things on their head as a way to sort of prove a point, okay? And I alluded to this a little bit before. You've got that whole concept of an inverted sentence, a sentence that deviates from the traditional subject, verb, object order. So as I said, normal English is subject, verb, object. The natural order of things in English is that. However, you're not bound to that. And certainly authors who are demonstrative of their own unique style are going to deviate from that, and a lot. So that means you might have object, verb, subject. Okay, so an example of that in my typical transitive example that I would give: I kicked the ball. You might say something like the ball I kicked, or something along those lines. Now, obviously, if you've got a sentence like that, you need to start asking, well, why would you do something so out of the ordinary? Well, you might say, well, it really accentuates the ball, or it makes you guess what's going on with the ball before you get to the actual subject and verb. So, yeah, you have to start reading between the lines. You're welcome to invert a sentence. You just need to have a good reason to do so, as with all things, okay? So that's the inverted sentence. And then the last thing, certainly something that you might remember from elementary or middle school, that whole concept of an exclamatory sentence. Okay, a sentence that expresses surprise or strong emotion, probably with an exclamation mark at the end. Be not only on the lookout for them, but also use them sparingly and significantly. Okay, I mean, if you're going to go to the trouble of having a sentence that has an exclamation point on the end, chances are it's going to be rather emphatic and in a very meaningful and deliberate way that you're going to have to start analyzing and interpreting. So it's just one of those other options that you have, all right? So that's the next step of stuff that I wanted to bring to your attention regarding syntax. Again, these are all things that you want to be on the lookout for as you're doing rhetorical analysis. When does an author do any of these things with clauses? Do they have any patterns to their clauses? Patterns such as frequent, simple, compound, complex, compound, complex sentences, or some of these syntactical schemes that pop up frequently or at specific moments for specific times and reasons, okay? Those are things that you want to be on the lookout for, because if you can draw our attention to them as the person reading your rhetorical analysis, you're going to go to great lengths to really reinforce and confirm whatever your thesis is as you're doing that rhetorical analysis. So that's that in a nutshell, guys. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to bring them to class the next time I see you. And hope that made some sense, and I will see you shortly, guys.